The Republican healthcare plan is out today, December 10th, as we record this. And it's not a whole lot to write home about. It's basically give give tax breaks to the rich and screw the middle class and everyone else who might be reliant on the subsidies. But the bigger picture, I think, is really important. And I think this topic is starting to come up more and more. Is essentially why don't we have Medicare for all already? And here to talk about that is he's America's #1 progressive talk radio host. You can find him live on terrestrial station Sirius XM Free Speech TV from noon to 3 Eastern daily during the week, and from 9 to noon Pacific during those same time periods. You can call in and say hi on my behalf. But without further anything else to go on about, Thom Hartmann is the author of also the Hidden History of American Healthcare. Let me get the subtitle here. Why Sickness Bankrupts You and Makes Others Insanely Rich. I was proud to help work on that book, but here to talk about why we don't have Medicare for all already. Thom, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Troy, it's nice to see you again.
So why don't we have Medicare for all or universal health care? Every other developed country in the world has figured this out, and there have been proposals for it that make perfect sense, or attempts to do it since the Kaiser's Germany, since 1880s Germany, right?
Yeah.
So why the hell haven't we been able to manage this yet?
All right. Well, the Kaiser implemented the world's first single-payer healthcare plan in Germany, and I believe it was 1886, might have been 87. And it's because he was a conservative. He knew that first of all, he wanted a healthy country to produce a healthy army. And secondly, he knew that the most efficient and cost-effective way to do it was with a single-payer plan. And so he put that into place. Teddy Roosevelt called for this in the early 1900s in the United States, President Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt called for it. Harry Truman called for it. Jack Kennedy called for it. Lyndon Johnson called for it. I mean, it's just, right across the board. But what happened was in the late 1880s, or maybe early 1890s, I'd have to go back and read my own book. It's been a couple of years since, we published that book. A fellow by the name of Frederick Hoffman came to the United States. He was a German. He was basically dodging the draft, and he was a statistician. He was kind of a wunderkind. He was really good with numbers. In fact, he did an analysis in the early 1900s living here in the United States. He never went back to Germany. He did an analysis of the association between diet and cancer, and produced a book that's about this thick. I have a copy of it, and it's still in print by Frederick Hoffman. And it's called Diet and Cancer. You can find it on Amazon. So he also started the American Lung Association. Back then, it had a different name. It was what, Easter Seals or something. I forget, or March of Dimes or something. It was one of those things, that became the American Lung Association, because he was the guy who identified the association between asbestos exposure and smoking and lung cancer. And again, this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So he married a woman in Georgia, Southern Belle, from a very wealthy Georgian family, the state of Georgia in the United States. And she introduced him to Southern society, as it were. And so he decided to do an analysis of Black people. And he did a 2-year-long statistical analysis, gathered all this data, found that Black people were about twice as likely as white people to die at a much earlier age, were far more likely to die of a whole variety of diseases, were more likely to get a whole variety of diseases. And he concluded that this was because they were Black people. It just apparently never occurred to him that it might be that this was the result of systemic discrimination, of
Right.
what we know now. And so he attributed it to race. And so in 1896, he published a book called Race Traits of the American Negro. And his solution for the race problem in America, which was very much a topic of conversation around the turn of that century, because Reconstruction had failed, post 1876. His solution, the conclusion that he came to, was that Black people were so genetically inferior that if we being America, white America, simply denied them health care, in a couple of generations, they would just die out naturally. And so he went on kind of a road show about this. He got a job with the Prudential Insurance Company and worked his way up to being a vice president of the Prudential Insurance Company, which, by the way, charged Black people more than white people for life insurance policies right up until the 1960s. The federal government had to intervene and stop them. And he did tours of state legislatures, and he testified before Congress and testified before multiple state legislators, basically saying what I just laid out. And, that this was the solution to the race problem in America. So every time a president or anybody would talk about a national healthcare system, Frederick Hoffman would be there. He didn't die until 1946. In fact, just before he died, said he was quite happy to have lived long enough to see Franklin Roosevelt die because he considered Roosevelt a demon. Because Roosevelt, wanted to give rights to all the Black people.
Right.
And every time anybody would come up and say, we need a national healthcare system, Frederick Hoffman and the Prudential Insurance Company would show up and say, no, 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 you don't want to do that. And the echo of this is found in Medicare. In Medicare, there's a 20% hole. The first 20% of your major expenses in Medicare you have to pay yourself, and that's why you have these so-called Medigap policies that fill in that 20% hole. Well, the reason that 20% hole was put there was when Ball, I forget his first name, Robert Ball, I think it is.
Robert Ball,
And
yeah.
yeah, Robert Ball and Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats were putting together Medicare, was that the not just conclusion, the known reality was that Black people were far more impoverished than white people and far less likely to be able to cough up that 20%. And so that 20% would serve as a barrier to Black people showing up in otherwise white hospitals and white doctors' offices, because Medicare was arguably the most effective anti-discrimination program the federal government had ever passed. Ball and LBJ got written into the Medicare law a provision that said that if a hospital was found to have discriminated against Black people, they lost all their Medicare revenues and faced fines. And Martin Luther King collaborated with some people who were close to Ball in putting together kind of a strike force, and of Black people who would travel around to hospitals all around the country and show up just to get turned away, just so that they could then threaten the hospital with their Medicare funding. And over the course of about 2 years, they flipped literally hundreds of hospitals from being all white, I mean, literally having signs out, all white, to being integrated. And it was a major turning point in civil rights in the United States. And MLK was very proud to have been part of it. But that's basically why we don't have a national healthcare system. And I'm convinced, given the current, the racism, the just naked, blatant, proud
Right.
racism of the current Republican Party, that's still why we don't have it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And well, I think the other aspect of it, and I helped you write this book, so is the basically the medical industrial industry, right? And the AMA basically making sure that these things remain privatized. These aren't treated as a human right in all of this. And with that, money in politics, right? Going back to the early 80s. And I think I would, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say the last serious attempt in American politics to get a universal health care plan through was with Ted Kennedy. And that was before I was born, right? And I might be mistaken on that, but the ACA is and Joe Lieberman basically crushed any the public option, right?
On behalf
Do
of the
you,
insurance companies.
on behalf of the insurance companies, exactly. And as you were talking, I was thinking, the other places that were very impoverished and had higher death rates than other places, once you remove the racial aspect of it, is geographically Appalachia. And you see that a lot of these programs, the anti-poverty programs, had to be geared towards Appalachia, but there is so much tension between what is supposed to be the state's sort of role, which is always the classic bastion of the racists, essentially, is,
Mm.
what is a state's right, an obligation, versus what should the federal government step in and do. And maybe this is a fine place to pivot to the other conversation I wanted to have with you, uh, which is I think part of the problem with a lot of our democratic politics, and I mean big D, Democratic Party politics these days, is that we've lost the ability to fight for universal goods and universal rights. And I think you see with Zohran Mamdani's win, for instance, that when you fight for universal rights and universal affordability things, right? Free buses for everyone, not means testing free buses or something like this, that we actually can get a lot of these things done. But it's between the very rich who want to keep us divided along those class lines, and they'll find every way to do it otherwise, and the racists who, honestly, I'm sure there's some of them who would turn down a blood transfusion if they knew it was coming from a black person. You know, um, thoughts on that?
I think that yeah, in 1976, the Supreme Court in the Buckley decision ruled that money is the same thing as speech.
Right.
And then in 2 years later, in the decision that Lewis Powell authored in First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, um, said this right extends to corporations as well. And that was the beginning. I mean, that's what's laid the foundation for the Reagan Revolution and brought Reagan into office on a tsunami of oil industry money. And it was the beginning of the really serious corruption of our political process. It overturned a lot of the good government laws that had been passed just 4 or 5 years prior to that in the wake of the Nixon and Agnew bribery scandals. And so you had the ability then of special interests, whether it was hospital corporations, insurance companies, the doctors union, the American Medical Association, basically to buy legislation. And so out of that um, emerged and the other thing is back in the 70s, I ran a business in the early 70s. We started it in 72 and I sold it in 78. And it was an herbal tea company in Michigan. And we had 18 employees at one point. And we provided healthcare to all of them. It was $35 per month per person, for a fairly comprehensive health insurance policy. Now, back then, a good annual salary was $15,000 a year, maybe 20, but um, which would probably be the equivalent of 50 now, but or more. But the reason why it was so inexpensive was in the state of Michigan, where we lived. Both health insurance companies and hospitals were required by state law to be nonprofits. And so
Mm-hmm.
we had three hospitals in Lansing, Sparrow, St. Lawrence, and Ingham Medical, and they were all nonprofits. And we bought our health insurance from Blue Cross Blue Shield, which was a nonprofit in the state of Michigan. It's Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. So one of the things that the Reagan Revolution brought, again, now that the insurance companies had the power to buy politicians, was the end of that. Michigan's law was, I don't know how many states had laws similar to Michigan's, but I know that the number was substantial. And so now there are no states, to the best of my knowledge, that require health insurance companies and hospitals to be nonprofits. And all of that changed as a result of the Reagan Revolution. So what you see is this doctrine of corporate personhood and the doctrine of money being speech, these two corrupt ideas that were invented out of thin air by this tobacco lawyer, Lewis Powell, who wrote the Powell memo. and laid the foundation for the Heritage Foundation and all of these other right-wing think tanks and the modern day Republican Party, that all of this stuff basically was oriented toward how do we maximize profit for big corporations and how do we
Right.
maximize, the wealth of the billionaires. And so, many of the decisions that have been made since then, frankly, by both parties. I mean, when Obama ran for president initially in 2008, he was talking about single payer healthcare.
Right.
But by the time he became president, he realized that there was no way that the health insurance companies, which by that point in time had gone from being, you know, diverse state-run companies to giant national monoliths, no way that they would allow that to happen. And as you point out, even having the government compete against the health insurance companies through a public option, which would have been, the camel's nose under the tent. I mean, that's the thing that would have been the beginning of a national healthcare system in the United States.
Right.
They were one vote away from it, and Joe Lieberman blew it up because he was taking millions, literally, from the health insurance industry in Connecticut. He was the Connecticut senator. So I think you could say in a very real way that from the 1880s or the 1890s anyway until the 1980s, the principal reason we never got a national healthcare system was racism. From the 1980s, or really probably the 1990s, I would say, starting in a big way with the Clinton administration.
Right.
Um, because Hillary started out talking about single payer and very quickly started talking about, well, maybe the Heritage Foundation is onto something and we can do something with the corporations. It really just became about money. And the Heritage Foundation had come up with, and there was a lot of this conversation going around. So the Heritage Foundation, this right-wing think tank that was funded by right-wing billionaires, came up with this plan that said, sure, we can have a national healthcare system. Let's just force everyone to buy insurance from the big insurance companies who are funding, presumably, I don't know to specifically that they were funding the Heritage Foundation at that time, but it wouldn't surprise me. Um, they were certainly funding the right-wing politicians. And so I think that you could safely say that, it's largely all about money now. And now you've got, these companies, the big five, six, or seven of them. This would be a conversation for you to have with Wendell Potter, and I know you know him quite well.
Mhm.
Um, uh, you know, they have literally billions of dollars every year in profits. I mean, just money laying around in the ground to hire lawyers, to buy politicians, to hire lobbyists, and they're gonna go to the mattresses on that. In the old mob sense, it'll be a shooting war, or metaphorically. So
Right. Well, and as I recall, it's two lobbyists for every member of Congress they can afford, and they do hire. And
yeah,
our friend Richard Eskow always jokes, "What is it? One work the day shift and the other work the night shift? What's up there?" But
yeah,
I think there's a central, yeah, there's a central tension through all of this, through the racism and what I'll just kind of summarize as the greed, which is the tension between capitalism and democracy. And FDR said, "A necessitous man is not a free man." Basically, if you have to, if you're worried about being able to make that health payment, and FDR, the health industry was nascent. It wasn't quite, and it wasn't anything like it looks like today. But if you're not able to afford your bills to live, then you're not a free man. And I hesitate to call him an economist, but Stephen Moore has said point blank that he prefers capitalism to democracy because there are very democratic countries that are very poor, and there are not very free countries that are very capitalist that are very rich. And it seems to me that this is kind of the core tension where we are right now. And it's almost like national myth making. Where do we come from? Do we come from this sort of every man pulls himself up for his bootstraps and every person is responsible for their own health? Or do we appreciate that healthcare is a right, a necessitous man is not a free man, and we don't have a democracy unless we have some sort of basic health assurances beyond here's $2,000 and good luck.
yeah. Well, and Stephen Moore said that on my program, by the way. I asked him which is more important, democracy or capitalism, and he said capitalism, of course. And his assertion was that you can't have a democracy without capitalism, which I reject. Um, I would say, regulated capitalism, probably, you might have a little stronger argument, but Stephen Moore was not a fan of regulated capitalism. Um, but uh, beyond that, I mean, I think, it's really important to note that there has throughout history been this tension between, not just capitalism, but capital, as
Right.
in das Kapital, as wealthy people and their interests and class interests versus democracy itself. This is why Thomas Jefferson said, we should never turn to the rich to preserve our democracy. Indeed, it has always been the rich who are at the forefront of corrupting governmental systems. It's why John Adams spoke out against the rich. It's why Ben Franklin spoke out against the rich. It's why, I mean, multiple of these people warned us about this. So um, it's a challenge and a struggle, and I think that you could argue that we're in an oligarchic phase in the United States right now. Um, we've become more oligarchy than democracy. Um, I can give you a long list. I'm sure you could recite it too, of probably 15 or 20 different specific policy positions, including a national healthcare system, free college, affordable housing, a higher minimum wage, the right to unionize, et cetera, that all poll above 80%, or certainly above 70%, right across the board
Right.
among Americans. And yet none of those things are happening. Well, if we were a genuine small d democracy, all of those things would be happening because the will of the people would be put into law. But because of the unrestrained capitalism, those things are not happening because of the corruption of the system by, five corrupt Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court, dating all the way back to 1978. Those things are not happening. So, I think the big challenge for American democracy in this era is going to be how do we get out of this? How do we get out of this oligarchic phase? I think it's really important to note, and I wrote about this in the Hidden History of American Oligarchy, that oligarchy is a transitional phase. Oligarchy is not a
Right.
permanent state. What happens is, oligarchy being a form of government where the government basically serves the oligarchs rather than its people. And the oligarchs aren't necessarily the rulers. They're just the ones who run the show. They rule the rulers essentially. And the problem with oligarchy, and the reason why it's a transitional system, is that when people realize that the oligarchs are pulling the strings of the system, they get pissed off and rise up. And the system then is confronted with two choices. It's a fairly binary choice. You can either say, okay, we give, and we're just going to go back to making money, us oligarchs. We're just going to go back to making money. We'll stop messing in politics. We're going to get out of this, and we'll let you have your country, which is what happened in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt became president after the DuPont brothers and a few others tried to kidnap and assassinate him unsuccessfully. Smedley Butler blew the whistle on them. And then he started calling them out in almost every speech he gave, referring to them as economic royalists. And, they said, okay, screw it. We don't want this battle. Well, that all changed in 76, 78, with these Supreme Court decisions. So, um, so that's one option that the oligarchs have, is to say, okay, we give. We're gonna give you back your democracy, which is what happened in the United States from 33 right up until 1980. The other alternative is to say, or arguably from 33 up until now, the other alternative is to say, as Putin did, as Erdogan did, as Orban did, as let's see, El-Sisi in Egypt, is to say, we're going to crack down. We're going to bring down the iron fist, and we're going to crush this rebellion. And the oligarchy transitions not back to democracy, but the oligarchy transitions into all full-blown autocracy, or
Right.
a police state essentially. And I think that that's what's happening right now. I think what we're seeing right now in the political debate and all the back and forth and even the battles within the Republican Party, like Marjorie Taylor Greene spinning out because her son is going to have to pay twice as much for his health insurance, is the Trump administration saying, okay, we're going to prepare to come down with the iron fist. We're going to deploy ICE all across the nation. We're going to get the legal authority to throw anybody we want in jail for as long as we want. We can have masked agents, armed agents, unaccountable to anybody. we're getting ready to crush the movement. And now with this latest thing that says that if you're anti-capitalist or if you're advocating, against traditional American values, you are a domestic terrorist. And, once you're labeled a terrorist, you lose a lot of rights. I think this is preparation for that. The big question that we're all facing is whether Trump and the Republicans are going to be able to pull that off. I don't think they will at the end of the day. I think they're losing power quickly, and the window within which they can do this is closing very rapidly. And I expect that, one of the reasons I think that Trump wants to have a war with Venezuela is because like the World War II provided FDR with an excuse to end habeas corpus, to suspend
Right.
the Constitution, essentially. Trump wants to do the same thing. And I think he thinks that if he can gin up a war with Venezuela, that will give him that excuse. So we'll see. We'll see. But
Well,
that's
or even
where we're
even
at.
George W. Bush with Iraq. I mean, you could see a Patriot Act 2.0. I mean, there's really modern equivalents. I will say, and because I have to let you go here in just a moment, but I appreciate the time, and I'll end with, from my side, some of your own words here, because I was reading through What Would Jefferson Do earlier in anticipation for another conversation I invited you for, and you describe the sacrifices that the signatories to the Declaration of Independence had to, went through in all of this, and you end the chapter by saying. After the war was over and the conservatives had fled to Canada and England, the survivors of the new American nation met to put into final form the legal structure of the nation they had just birthed. It was not to be a nation of cynical, selfish libertarians who believed the highest value was individual freedom and independence from society, or that the greatest motivator was greed. It was not to be a kingdom ruled by a warlord elite. It was not to be a theocracy where religious leaders made the rules, has had been several of the states, and it was not to be a feudal nation ruled by the rich. As Benjamin Franklin told Philadelphia's Mrs. Powell after she asked him what sort of nation had been conceived, it was to be, he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. That all resonates with today in a way that I'm not sure that you wrote that during the Bush years, but prescient.
Yeah.
And
I think we're facing a challenge that's not dissimilar to the challenge that the founding generation faced.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just say, what are those traditional American values? I'd say you summed them up there. And I'd say we're seeing the intersection of those three kind of forces between the religious elite and the business elite and the wannabe kings, all working. Yeah. And I think the only saving grace we have is they can't decide between themselves who should be at the tippy top. So, with
Seems
that, Tom, and I will say here in West Virginia, we've been dealing with a Republican supermajority for a decade now, and we have certainly been saved by the fact that they can't figure out which of the autocratic orders needs to be put into law. With that, Thom Hartmann, the author of dozens of books, we talked about several of them here, America's #1 progressive talk radio host. Thank you, as always, for the time. Thank you for your friendship and your mentorship over the years. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
No, it's always great talking to you, Troy, and I appreciate all the help you've given me over all these years. With several of our books, last hour's mentioned Sunlight and this one. And it's great to be on your program. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Tom. We'll talk soon. Have a happy new year if we don't talk before then.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.